So let's start with maybe what happened with the New Deal, just like a broader picture of the New Deal. What was that like, and how did it change the infrastructure of America and of the world?
So the New Deal was a period of very rapid change in the relationship between the federal government and individuals in America. Before the New Deal, most government, when people thought of government, they thought of their local government or maybe by that stage the state government. But during the New Deal, the federal government really comes to the fore and begins to directly act on individual Americans in a number of profound ways. So we go basically from a classical liberal sort of society where if there was a problem, people would say, well, what can I do to get with my neighbors in order to, ameliorate this issue? After the New Deal, Americans start to say, what can Washington do to solve this problem? So
Yes.
it was, some people at the time, like Garrett Garrett, a journalist who was critical of the New Deal, basically said that it was a revolution. It was bloodless, but it was a sort of coup. It's where the federal government took over the reins of government from state and local governments and essentially began implementing policies that would make the founders lament the passing of the republic, basically. Just to is it sort of the lowest point of this, or the highest point, if you're a fan of the federal government, was a 1942 Supreme Court decision called Wickard, where the Supreme Court said that the federal government had the power to prevent a farmer from growing crops that were going to be used for his personal consumption only.
Yeah, that there's huge implications to that, right? Like, and we often think in terms of how things are today kind of being normal, but what you're saying is that back then people had a lot more liberty. Like you didn't need the government's permission to have cows or have chickens to provide food for your own family, right?
Right. And in fact, one way that people talk about the sea change is that before the New Deal, there was a presumption of liberty. Americans could do what they wanted, and the government had to prove that there was a public interested reason for preventing you from engaging in that activity. After the New Deal, it became the burden of citizens to prove that they had a right to do something, like in the case of Wickard, to grow whatever crops and whatever amounts they wanted. So it was very clearly a very major change. FDR becomes president in 1933, but actually some of these changes began under the Hoover administration. So that's why I date it. And also traditional New Deal historians end at about 1938, when the second New Deal, as it's called, sort of ran out of steam. But I put World War II in there because it's the same president and he's following the same agenda, as we'll see. And that agenda
Right.
is more and more power for him and for the federal government and less liberty for individual Americans.
And was this happening, Robert, because this was kind of a trend of the times? Like this was what was going on in Europe as well. It was no longer popular to have individual liberty. It was becoming more that the individual should sacrifice themselves in some ways to whatever the state apparatus wanted to do.
That's right, and I devote an entire chapter in the book to talking about the progressive movement, which was a little bit earlier in the 20th century and reached its peak during the Great War, World War One, when Woodrow Wilson was president, and that's when we get the national income tax, and the Federal Reserve is formed. And of course, during the Great War, there were all kinds of wartime restrictions put in place. And the progressives really picked up on that. A lot of progressives, at the leadership level, the policy level, were trained in European universities because we didn't have PhD granting universities yet, right? So Americans went to Europe
Interesting.
and were educated and then came back and formed their own PhD programs. And eventually we would be number one, but for a long time, the place to go was Germany. That's where most
Ah,
historians and economists were trained from that progressive era, and they learned, Bismarckian strong central state sort of theories and ways of thinking, and brought it back to the United States. Harvard, Yale, the University of Wisconsin were big centers for this progressive intellectual
oh,
milieu.
that's really interesting. I was reading The Road to Serfdom, and Frederick von Hayek, he talks about that, how actually the German academics were talking about kind of redefining liberty around that time, and they were really espousing kind of ideas of socialism, which later turned into fascism. And so that was kind of a trend. And I didn't actually know how those ideas were transported to America. So it was really through the university, how people started to think about things, and then that kind of spread into policy. We kind of look at the system that's around us, and you're explaining that in your book, I guess the architecture for how things are now was kind of laid out during that period around, the 1930s and 1940s. So, can we maybe go into some of your specifics about that? You have